Okay, let's unpack this because I want you to imagine something. So, imagine you are trying to learn the rules of a brand new board game.
Right.
But the catch here is the rules of this game are changing every single day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, while you're actively playing it. Now take that feeling, multiply it by 1,000,000, and imagine you're trying to write the permanent rule book for an entire continent's university system under those exact same conditions.
That sounds mildly stressful.
Just a bit. And that is exactly the tension we're exploring today in our deep dive into this fascinating collection of strategy documents and reports surrounding the Center for Artificial Intelligence and Sustainable Development, or CAISD for short.
Yeah.
Our mission today is to really understand how African higher education is attempting to pivot, right? Going from this panic or reactive stance on new technology to, well, a much more proactive, policy-driven integration ahead of a massive conference in September 2026.
It's a really critical pivot, too. And, you know, the sources make it very clear that this is about far more than just, like, updating the campus IT policy.
Yeah, definitely.
The documents map out this deliberate, highly structured attempt to basically shift the balance of global intellectual power.
Which is huge.
It is, and it's all culminating in that major summit you mentioned, scheduled for September 2026.
Right, so to set the scene for you listening, based on our stack of sources, the foundational facts look kind of like this. You have the University of Cape Town, CAISD, and a group called Frank Dialogue Holdings. And they signed a Memorandum of Understanding, an OU, back in April 2026.
Exactly.
And the goal of this MOU is to host a high-level, aggressively solutions-oriented conference at UCT. But to really understand the urgency of this September summit, we have to look at the massive behavioral shifts that are, already happening on the ground.
Yeah, the data is wild.
It really is.
Yeah.
The data in these sources outlines just an absolute explosion in grassroots adoption.
The underlying numbers are honestly what forced this from, like, a slow, long-term academic discussion into an immediate crisis response. According to this 2026 Google Ipsos survey that's cited in the reports, 70% of South African adults have now used an AI chatbot.
Wait, 70%?
70%.
That is a 25 percentage point jump just since 2023, which, that officially puts South African adoption rates above the global average.
Yeah, it's moving incredibly fast.
But the metric that really contextualizes the university's panic, I think, is the impact on learning. Of the people using generative AI specifically for schoolwork or research, 87% report a positive impact.
87%.
Right. That tells me this is no longer a novelty. Students aren't just, playing around with funny prompts anymore. They are actively relying on these systems to do the heavy lifting of their academic lives.
Right. Generative AI is currently reshaping the architecture of higher learning from the bottom up. I mean, students are leveraging these tools to synthesize vast amounts of literature for their dissertations.
Yeah, the literature reviews alone.
Oh, exactly. They're cross-referencing thousands of studies in minutes to find data correlations that, honestly, might have taken a human researcher weeks to identify manually.
Wow.
And it's not just the students either. The sources detail how lecturers who are operating in pretty resource-scarce environments are utilizing AI to design entirely new curricula.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, and they're generating these personalized learning simulations for massive classes where, individualized attention was previously just impossible.
So on one hand, you have this massive grassroots surge, right? Where the actual users, the students and the faculty, are integrating AI into their daily cognitive workflows.
Exactly.
It's kind of like building a high-speed rail network while the trains are already running on dirt tracks.
That's a great way to put it.
But when we look at the institutional response, from the major universities down to the TVET colleges, those are the institutions focusing on vital vocational and technical trades, there seems to be a massive lag.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Is the higher education sector just suffering from its typical bureaucratic inertia? Or is there a specific systemic roadblock holding these institutions back from publishing official AI guidelines?
What's fascinating here is that the sources emphasize it's far deeper than typical red tape.
Really?
Yeah. We're looking at a profound institutional void. Out of the dozens of institutions surveyed, only a handful have instituted any meaningful AI frameworks.
Just a handful.
Right. The vast majority are trapped in the state of paralysis, and it's primarily driven by a web of complex ethical and philosophical hurdles that they simply don't know how to navigate at a policy level.
Okay, so one of those hurdles being algorithmic bias.
Absolutely.
Because we know these large language models are predominantly trained on data scraped from the global north. So if I'm, say, an engineering student in Nairobi or a history major in Cape Town, and I'm using an AI to help structure my research, I might be unwittingly importing a deeply Western perspective into my work.
That is the absolute core of the friction. And it bleeds directly into another major concept the sources spend a lot of time on, which is the ongoing pursuit of epistemic justice.
Okay, epistemic justice. Break that down for me.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the fundamental question of who actually owns, creates, and validates what we consider to be truth in these academic spaces.
Precisely. To put it in a practical context, universities across the African continent have spent decades actively trying to decolonize their curricula.
Right.
They're doing the really hard work of ensuring that indigenous knowledge systems, local histories, and non-Western perspectives are valued and taught rigorously instead of just, defaulting to inherited colonial frameworks.
Yeah, that's a massive undertaking.
It is. And the deep fear outlined in the CAISD documents is that integrating an AI model, which might fundamentally misunderstand or actively minimize African historiography simply because it lacks sufficient training data on it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it could quietly undo years of that decolonization effort.
It's like, okay, think of it like passing out an incredibly advanced auto-translate earpiece to every single student and professor on campus.
Okay, I like this.
Right. So it allows them to communicate and research at lightning speed. But the earpiece only really understands the cultural slang, the historical context, and the economic assumptions of Silicon Valley.
Yes,
So it works, but it subtly alters the meaning of everything being processed through it.
that is a highly accurate way to visualize the mechanism of the threat. And then you pair that philosophical threat with the absolute nightmare of basic academic integrity.
Oh, grading.
Yeah, imagine trying to grade a complex master's thesis when you literally cannot determine where the student's original thought ends and the machine's predictive text begins.
It's practically impossible.
It is. The administrators are staring down a technological revolution that challenges the very nature of how knowledge is validated.
So administrators can't just issue a blanket ban. Because, like we said, that 87% positive impact rating means students are just going to use it in secret anyway.
Exactly, which just widens the gap between institutional policy and reality.
Right. But they also can't just blindly endorse it without protective frameworks. This brings us to why a purely academic response like just having scholars debating these nuances in a faculty lounge somewhere isn't going to solve the problem.
No, it's not enough.
You need genuine authority, and you need structural capital. Which brings us to the formation of this very specific summit.
Right, so the initiative really took shape during a strategic meeting at UCT's historic Bremner building.
And for you listening, understanding the location of this meeting is actually key to understanding its weight. The Bremner building isn't just, a generic campus facility.
No, not at all.
It's the home of the Vice Chancellor's office. It is the administrative nerve center of the university. So the fact that this alliance was forged there signals that this isn't a fringe faculty project. It has absolute top-level institutional backing.
Yep.
And the room itself was this unique collision of sectors. You had Professor Mosa Moshabella, the UCT Vice Chancellor. You had Professor Ankapase J.J. Tabane, the founder and CEO of Frank Dialogue Holdings, who's representing media and public discourse. And Dr. Alexander Essom, the co-chair of CAISD, bringing the policy and sustainable development angle.
It's quite a lineup, and the mandate they drafted in that room is an ambitious departure from how higher education usually handles crises.
How so?
Well, they explicitly state in the MOU that they have zero interest in hosting a symbolic talk shop.
Nice.
They aren't looking to publish a list of well-intentioned declarations that just get filed away in some digital archive. They designed a non-hierarchical structure for the September summit, deliberately mixing government ministers, regional regulators, vice chancellors, tech innovators, and student representatives in the exact same working sessions.
And the reason for that non-hierarchical mix seems to tie directly into, well, probably the most stubborn hurdle in academia, the chronic lack of funding.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it always comes back to resource allocation.
Always.
The reports observe that African universities are not lacking in intellectual capacity or ambition. They have the researchers. They understand the stakes of algorithmic bias.
Right.
What they lack is the raw capital required to build sovereign AI infrastructure. We're talking about the millions of dollars needed to run local compute clusters, to license proprietary data sets, to continually train faculty, and to actually run widespread pilot programs that test these policies in real time.
So think about this from the perspective of your own professional life, right? If you've ever tried to pitch a new workflow software or just a minor tech upgrade to your management, you know how incredibly difficult it is to secure funding for something tangible.
Oh, yeah. Good luck.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, imagine trying to attract international investors to fund something entirely invisible. You are essentially asking them to sink massive capital into structural AI policy, ethical frameworks, and curriculum redesign for millions of students.
Which is a phenomenally difficult pitch.
Right, because there's no immediate measurable financial return on investment.
Which is exactly why the Bremner Building Alliance is attempting to engineer the room itself. By bringing the venture capitalists and international tech innovators to the table from day one, seating them right alongside the ministers who write the regional laws and the vice chancellors who actually deploy the tech.
Oh, that's smart.
They're trying to bridge that massive resource gap in a structured environment. They are actively attempting to collapse the distance between the people who understand the academic need and the people who hold the purse strings.
It's an ambitious play, for sure, but obviously fraught with friction. Getting the right people in the room is really only half the battle.
That's the easy part, arguably.
Right. Once you have everyone sitting there, what actual framework do you build? Because drafting a unified tech policy for a continent as vast and economically diverse as Africa seems nearly impossible. And the sources reveal this fascinating debate that happened right there in the Bremner Building about how to even approach the design of this policy.
Yeah, the documents outline two distinct, seemingly contradictory perspectives that emerged regarding the underlying philosophy of the regulatory framework.
Okay, so on one side of the table, you have Professor Moshe Bella, the UCT Vice Chancellor, advocating for an outward-looking approach.
Right.
He argues that they need to study and adapt global best practices, and he specifically points to the National University of Singapore as the gold standard.
And Singapore is a highly instructive model to study. Their system relies on a tight, incredibly agile feedback loop between state-backed investment and university research.
How agile are we talking?
Very. In Singapore, if a university identifies a novel AI application, the government ministries can almost immediately draft a regulatory sandbox to test it safely.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a system characterized by long-term strategic foresight and massive centralized financial resources. Moshe Bella's argument is that African institutions really need to learn the operational mechanics of a system that has successfully positioned itself at the absolute forefront of global AI adoption.
Okay, but then on the other side of the table, you have Dr. Essam from CAISD. And he grounds the room by pointing out that a carbon copy of Singapore's model simply won't survive the transition to Africa.
Exactly.
He pushes for a very inward-looking approach, arguing that this summit must be a genuinely continental, African-led dialogue from the very first session. It cannot just be like a South African initiative that tries to graft continental ambitions onto its final draft later on.
Right.
His point is that if the regulatory solutions aren't organically rooted in the highly diverse, resource-scarce realities of African nations, the various governments simply will not adopt them.
It creates a really fascinating intellectual tension.
Yeah.
You have this desire for Singapore's operational dominance clashing directly with the absolute necessity for African contextual survival.
Well, I have to ask, though, how do they actually reconcile that? Because those sound like two fundamentally incompatible directions.
They do.
Like, how do you integrate a model built on massive centralized state wealth into an environment characterized by fragmented policies and severe funding bottlenecks?
Well, the CAISD strategy documents argue that the solution is synthesis. It's not about choosing one over the other. The goal isn't to copy Singapore's bank account, right?
Okay.
The goal is to study their architecture. The summit is designed to dissect the mechanisms of Singapore's agility. Like, how exactly do they negotiate data sharing agreements between the public and private sectors? How do they construct their testing sandboxes?
I see.
You take those architectural blueprints, but you apply them strictly through the contextual reality of African higher education.
So it's about extracting the methodology, not the exact policy itself.
Exactly.
You build a fast-moving, responsive policy framework, but you populate that framework with local data protections, epistemic justice safeguards, and funding models that actually make sense for the region.
The core mandate established in these sources captures that dual lens perfectly. The objective of the September conference is to forge collaborative, responsible policy frameworks that, quote, serve African higher education on African terms.
On African terms.
Yeah. To achieve that, the policy must be globally informed. So administrators understand exactly what the bleeding edge of the technology looks like, but strictly African-led in its implementation and ethical boundaries.
So what does this all mean when we step back and look at the whole board? The three line of this deep dive is a profound structural refusal to be reactive. African academia is actively rejecting the role of like a passive consumer waiting for technology to be handed down from the global north.
They are actively moving to control the parameters of their own technological integration.
And the triad they've constructed to do this is genuinely formidable. UCT brings the heavy academic credibility and the institutional infrastructure.
Right.
Frank Dialogue Holdings brings the media innovation and the ability to steer live, high-stakes public discourse, so these policies don't just get trapped in an academic echo chamber.
Which happens a lot.
Constantly. And then CAISD grounds the entire initiative in sustainable development and rigorous AI governance. Together, they're trying to architect a space where the continent dictates its own digital future.
And if you're listening and wondering why a higher education conference happening in Cape Town this September matters to you, whether you're a student, a professional navigating your own industry's AI integration, or just someone observing this massive technological shift.
Yeah, why should they care?
It matters because universities remain the fundamental engines of truth generation for society.
That is a great point.
The protocols these institutions establish today regarding how they handle data privacy, how they actively mitigate algorithmic bias, and how they define intellectual authorship, that will eventually dictate the quality and fairness of the information we all rely on tomorrow. The frameworks debated at UCT will inevitably ripple outward, influencing the broader global digital ecosystem.
It is localized policy that ultimately shapes a globally connected reality. I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the SASD documents. It's really a privilege to dissect these complex institutional shifts with you, and I hope this provided some clarity on the sheer scale of the logistical and philosophical hurdles facing the future of education. Keep staying curious and keep digging into the mechanics behind the headlines.
Before we wrap, I want to leave you with a final thought to explore on your own that builds on everything we've unpacked today.
Okay, let's hear it.
We spent a lot of time discussing the friction of algorithmic bias and the deep desire for African institutions to build bespoke, decolonized AI frameworks that accurately reflect their own knowledge systems.
Right.
Well, if this September summit is successful and they manage to build these highly accurate, structurally agile African-led AI models, how will the legacy universities of the global north react?
Oh, interesting.
As students and researchers worldwide become increasingly aware of the historical biases baked into Western-trained AI, could we see a massive global migration where the international academic community actually prefers to use the African models for their research simply to escape that legacy bias?
Wow.
It is a fascinating shift in intellectual leverage to consider.